It's always good to start with thank you to those who made this possible, and to Suzanne for taking the bull by the horns and first of all last year telling me what this was all about and volunteering to organize it, so thank you. And to Anna, who makes sure that we have food and drink to make it more pleasant. And so thank you. Small but very appreciative audience we have here. And I'm really excited about this. I think these are two of our younger, more junior faculty, whichever you want to say, both younger or junior. And I would, from what I know, consider both of them rising stars. And I think we are in for a treat today. So I think that needs you gals need no further introduction. For those of you that might not know, Susan Letcher in Environmental Studies, and Rachel Dickstein in Theater Performance on the Conservatory. And Susan, I understand you're going to go first?
Yeah.
Okay.
Great. Thank you so much, Barbara. And thanks to Suzanne for organizing this, and thanks to everybody for coming tonight. I asked to go first because I thought there's no way I can follow a theater person. So I'm going to talk about some of the research that's underway right now, some of the upcoming projects, because I think that's really the exciting stuff, where it's going. If you want to know about what I've done, call me, we'll have coffee, we'll talk. So my topic tonight is tropical forests on a changing planet, because I think we're all aware of how human activity is changing the earth we live on and changing the ecosystems around us. But we don't always think about how it's affecting ecosystems in other parts of the world. And we tend to think of tropical forests as being sort of this last bastion of wilderness, this primeval, beautiful, wonderful, the Amazon, there are monkeys and jaguars and macaws and this wilderness. And it is wilderness. There's a lot of wilderness left in the tropical regions of the planet, but not perhaps as much as we tend to think. Tropical forests in most of the world look a little bit more like this. You can see clearings and you can see evidence of human intervention here, either logging or agriculture. And this is more the norm in the tropics across the world. And every 5 years, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations puts out a report talking about the state of the world's forests and summarizing what we know about forest cover in different parts of the world. And according to the latest one, 35% of the world's tropical forests fall in that sort of old growth, primeval, undisturbed category. And the rest of it is in some way impacted pretty heavily, in many cases, by human activity. So log forests, degraded forests, whether it's burned, whether the big trees are taken out, or secondary forest regrowing after disturbance. A lot of the work that I've done in the past has been dealing with this last category of secondary forests and how forests come back and how communities of species reassemble after forests have been logged and knocked back to nothing. But what I'm going to talk about tonight is what's going on in that 35% and how human activity is impacting that. So my major research areas for now, the forest succession and forest recovery is kind of the hopeful part of it. And climate change impacts on intact forest is the depressing part. So for better or worse, you guys get the depressing stuff. So we all know that the world is changing. The atmosphere is changing drastically due to human activities. So these are carbon dioxide measurements from 1500 to 2007, going up to about 360 parts per million. Anybody know where we are today?
It's not much, about 380 maybe.
392 when I last checked it. There's a website, co2now.org, where you can get the, yeah. So 392 when I checked this afternoon. And that's kind of scary. We're off the chart there. And temperature variations in the Earth's atmosphere are very tightly linked to that CO2. It acts as a blanket, trapping heat from bouncing back into space. And the more CO2 we put into the atmosphere, the higher those temperatures get, the more the heat can't escape. And this is a prediction showing what the world's going to look like in roughly 2070 compared to what it looked like in 1960 to 1990. So the darker the colors, the darker the shading on that figure, the hotter those areas of the world are predicted to be. And we think of global warming, we don't necessarily think of the heterogeneity that's involved. So some parts of the world are predicted to warm a lot more than others. And one of the areas that's predicted to warm the most is right across the Amazon basin, one of these last remaining areas of old growth tropical forest. And another part that's predicted to warm quite strongly is Central America, where I've been doing most of my research. So understanding how temperature impacts tropical forests it's a really critical thing to look at. One of the things that plants do when they take in carbon, or let me take a step back here. So when plants are exposed to light, they're photosynthesizing, they're taking in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, turning it into sugars, turning it into the base of the food chain that we all depend on. But plants also, like us, they respire. They essentially breathe out carbon dioxide. And when plants are in the light, exposed to sunlight, they can capture carbon dioxide, undergo photosynthesis, go through this process of fixing carbon, turning it into sugars. And both these processes, their photosynthesis or taking carbon out of the atmosphere, and the respiration where they put that carbon back in the atmosphere, both of these processes are linked to temperature. But the shape of those curves is a little bit different. So with photosynthesis, generally what we see is that rates of photosynthesis will increase with temperature up to a point, and then they'll level off, and they may at some point start to actually drop off with very high temperatures. Photosynthesis, or respiration on the other hand, shows an exponentially increasing relationship with temperature. And at some point these curves cross. And at that point, plants aren't taking in enough energy and converting enough energy into sugars to make up for the energy that they're losing and the carbon that they're losing through respiration. And this is pretty worrisome. These plants that are at this point can't support themselves. They can't take in enough carbon to make up for those respiratory losses. And so you see reductions in growth, you see higher mortality of plants at this temperature threshold, but the question is, where is this threshold? Are we at or near this threshold? Are we likely to reach it soon? And that's a question that ecologists are debating really strongly right now, and nobody has a terribly good handle on it. But we do have some evidence that's cause for alarm. So this is showing growth deviations for 6 canopy tree species in a project that I got involved in last year that's been measuring tree growth annually since 1984. And we can look at, so this is the growth deviations. It's compared to that almost 30-year now average of growth. When are the years when things grow well? When are the years that things grow poorly? So each of those double digits there is representing a year. And we had some really cool years, 1986 and 1985. when things did well. And then there's this pretty strong relationship that the hotter that average nighttime temperature is, the worse trees do. And we see this relationship as well with mortality. So the hotter years, we're seeing more trees dying. So I'm involved in this continuing research to try to figure out how close trees are to that temperature optimum, how they're responding to this continuing climate change, and try to figure out some of the things that are driving that. So this one project I'm involved in is called the Trees Project. This was started by Deborah Clark and her husband David Clark, both forest ecologists at University of Missouri. And I asked Deborah, when she first approached me to see if I was interested in this project, I asked her, what does trees stand for anyway? She said it stands for these beautiful tropical organisms that store carbon. So we have annual tree growth data that's going back to 1983 for six tree species, and we have data from 1990 for an additional 3 species that have different ecological requirements and different growth rates. And we also have some of the best meteorological data anywhere in the tropics. We have half-hourly measurements of temperature and of vapor pressure deficit, which is a measure of how much humidity there is in the air. And we have more than 65,000 measurements now, very fine-scale annual growth data. And so this has allowed us to produce these curves like you saw in the previous slide, looking at relationships between weather data, climate data, and tree growth. I just want to briefly introduce you to the people who are the heart of this project. So Deborah Clark and Leo Campos and William Miranda were our Costa Rican field techs who are right now collecting data for this project. And there's myself and a younger tropical field incarnation. So the goals of this project, we have funding now to extend this data set to 2017, which will be 33 years of annual data. It'll be the longest data set of its type anywhere in the tropics. And we want to continue studying climate impacts because the climate there is warming pretty sharply. And so we're seeing years now that are outside the climate envelope that we've seen even in those 30 years of data. Another thing that I'm really interested in is impacts of lianas. So lianas are really cool. These are the woody vines. They're more common in the tropics than in the temperate zone. Rather than allocating their carbon to one straight support trunk and standing in the same place, lianas explore space. They depend on other plants for support, and they drape themselves over the branches, and they cling on to other plants, and so they can allocate their resources to exploring space and competing for resources rather than building a straight trunk. And so they compete very strongly with trees for above ground resources like light and for below ground resources like water and nutrients. And there's evidence from all across the tropics that in recent years, liana abundance has increased. And we're still trying to figure out the mechanisms for this. One thing is that we see a stronger response in experiments with elevated carbon dioxide. Lianas respond generally stronger than trees do, and that we also see higher drought tolerance in lianas than trees. And so this is really profoundly changing the way that tropical forests behave and how they store carbon. And if you get this competition between trees and lianas, you can get a turnover between a forest that's slow growing and that's stable to a forest that's a lot more dynamic, where when lianas link trees together, they pull more trees down when there's a large tree fall gap. And the trees that are best at shedding lianas and getting rid of them are usually the fast-growing, soft-wooded trees that store a lot less carbon. So we have some baseline data on lianas in the trees individuals. And I have some money from the FAIR professorship funded by the Heinemann Foundation to bring a student down there, and I just applied for another grant to bring another student with me to do a resurvey of lianas on these trees. So we want to go back and visit the trees from our data set from 1986 that are still standing and look at whether the ones that had little or no colonization of lianas are now totally covered, or whether there's some dynamic turnover there. And we're also going to compare it to trees of similar diameter now to those trees, the size of those trees back in 1986. We want to see whether, if we look at the individual tree scale, are we seeing an increase in Liana abundance? And we also want to compare that original cohort that was measured in 1986 and see, did they grow more slowly and did they die sooner? If we look at just the trees that had a lot of Liana cover in 1986 compared to the ones that were relatively Liana free. So a couple of other projects. How are we doing on time? All right, so a couple of other things I'm working on, and this is something that I'm just putting together money, trying to get money for now, is to actually look at carbon exchange at the branch scale. So we have measurements at the leaf scale from tropical trees, looking at their carbon exchange, how much carbon they're taking in. And we have landscape scale measurements where people mount sensors on a tower and they measure how air moves through that tower, and they sample it every 30 seconds or every 10 seconds to get measurements of carbon dioxide. But the trouble with that is that in a lot of the global tropics, there's no air movement at night. And so you can't really sample air that's not moving. So one way to approach this is to have these branch bag setups where you put a branch into a bag it's transparent to infrared radiation, so it won't heat up. And the branch is in there exchanging carbon dioxide. You have air flowing through this bag at a known rate, and you can measure how much carbon dioxide goes into the bag and how much comes out. So you get an idea of how much that branch inside that bag is taking up. So we want to do this in Florida, in the tree canopy in Costa Rica. I have 2 collaborators on this grant as of like an hour ago. Maria Uriarte at Columbia does all kinds of wonderful mathematical models, and she's going to help me with the inverse modeling side of this. Steve Oberbauer at Florida International is a plant physiologist and does a lot of instrumentation stuff, and he's going to help with the nitty-gritty setting this up. So what we want to do is put these bags around the branches, have this infrared gas analyzer that's going to measure carbon dioxide flow, and we'll be measuring micrometeorology, so what's going on with temperature, humidity, rainfall right at that site, and what's going on with soil moisture. And get a really accurate picture of how these trees are behaving on a day-to-day basis, and then use inverse modeling, which is this field of mathematics I'm just starting to learn about, to compare these data in present day and sort of model back with our almost 30-year data set and see if we can get a better idea of how weather conditions from day to day shape carbon storage in tropical forests. And the end goal of this is to try to get at better estimations of where the carbon is on land and what influences the movement of carbon from the forests into the atmosphere and vice versa. And that's a huge uncertainty right now in our understanding of where the carbon is on Earth. We don't know. There's a missing chunk in the global carbon balance, and part of it has to do with this flux, this movement between tropical forests and the atmosphere. So one other project I'm involved in is a long-term reforestation project. Here's the hopeful side of things. Tropical forests can and do recover fairly fast from disturbance. And one of the things that I'm involved in studying is, how fast do forests come back? And can we take measures to improve that, to make the species composition recover faster, and to make the biomass, the amount of living matter in these forests, recover faster? So one project that I'm involved in is with a pair of collaborators who live in Costa Rica and own about a 100-acre farm down there, where they're actively replanting cattle pasture with native species, with the goal of having a beautiful forest of native species in the end. And along the way, studying how the initial diversity that you plant influences the diversity of what comes in, both in terms of insects, in terms of plants, in terms of birds eventually. And this summer, with some funding from Natural and Social Sciences, I was able to take a student down there to do some measurements of initial vegetation conditions and light conditions in these young forests. And as I said, it's amazing how fast this stuff comes back. Those trees are 2.5 years old. So another project I'm involved in, I've got projects all over the globe these days. I got involved with a group of researchers at the Chinese Academy of Forestry. And last November, they invited me there to visit their field sites and talk about potential collaborations. So we're developing this worldwide network of forest succession researchers and trying to understand what happens as these forests are coming back after disturbance, and what happens to forests, what's happening also in the old growth forests, these purportedly undisturbed forests nearby. So that is about it. I'm going to wrap up. I want to thank the organizations that have made this possible, and to thank Barbara and Suzanne again for setting things up. So thank you very much.
Haven't we in the past had both presentations and then questions?
Yes.
Yeah, so.
Can you switch to your presentation here?
Well, Susan said we should have taught to figure out how we could link these two, but actually we didn't. But actually one of the projects I'm working on right now is a site-specific piece that takes place in a former arboretum filled with 150-year-old trees.
Very cool.
Totally accidentally. I was having some PowerPoint issues earlier today, so there'll be a slight awkward. There's some video I want to show you. And it's supposed to really be beautifully embedded in PowerPoint. PowerPoint just didn't want to behave today, so anyway, thank you for me to Barbara and Suzanne. It's nice to be here to talk to you. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the work I've done in the past and some projects I'm doing right now. There's not a real risk of me overwhelming. I'm not a performer, I'm a director, so I like watching everything rather than putting on the show. Anyway, one of the reasons I became a director is because of Virginia Woolf, which is kind of ironic because she didn't really write very many plays, and her plays are really not very good. It's sort of her novels and her stories that I think are the most compelling. But one of Virginia Woolf's many splendid obsessions was writing about moments in time. And in the essay called The Moment, she describes the moment as the center of the knot of consciousness, a slice of experience shot through with terror and exultation. Terror and exultation. Which was immediately really fascinating to me. And I wanted to quote more from this essay, and the entire thing is the most magnificent thing. And I realized there's probably reasons why as a theater director I'm interested in this, because my job is to look to craft and shape truthful action with actors on stage in a moment in time, and make that as compelling and rich and terror-filled and exultant-filled as possible. And I think Woolf understands the truth and complexity, that knot of consciousness, better than just about anybody. I have, the last 20 years in theater, I've mostly focused on creating adaptations. And Virginia Woolf's The Waves was the first one I made, with Jordan Schulcrout, who we were undergraduates together at Yale, and he dramaturged and co-adapted it with me. And so I'm going to show an embarrassing photo from a college production. But it sort of was there at the beginning, I guess, of my work on adaptation and on looking at how to make novels live on stage. And that's really what I want to talk about today. At the same time that I was immersing myself in Woolf's work, I was also introduced to by a number of wonderful teachers and professionals to physical theater methods, and I became really intrigued by how to create theater that was as powerful visually and kinetically as it was textually. And there's a lot of dance theater artists. If you saw Pina, like a lot of people last year, or Pina Bausch's work that's on right now at BAM, you can see a lot of dance theater is more episodic. It's not necessarily story-driven. It's magnificent, and I pray at Pina Bausch's feet. But I was interested in how to use that form with actors, for one thing, and in a way that could give an audience as much of an anchor in storytelling and character as you would get from a straightforward play. So my first sort of experiment with that was with the waves, and I'll call it an early effort. Jordan and I can laugh, so I won't show you more than this photo, except to say that the book is broken up into a number of chapters that are introduced by descriptions of nature, which I made into dances, and the 6 characters of the book I personified with 6 actors, and they sort of come together in the end. And it was basically the way that I could experiment with dance vocabulary, meshing, dialoguing with storytelling vocabulary that actors use. So I didn't touch Woolf's work again for another 16 years. I spent a lot of time in the 90s after college, traveling and trying to learn from other artists who were making movement-based theater. And so this is a picture of a teacher of mine from Bali in Indonesia. And this is a mask dance that I studied called Legong, which is one of many forms of Balinese mask dance, and was something I did train in myself, because you can't really go and observe, they just make you do it. And it was pretty fantastic. I also spent time with a company in London called Complicité. I went to Jean Loon in Minneapolis, Looking Glass, Mary Zimmerman in Chicago. You might know her from Metamorphosis that came to Broadway. Basically just tried to build as broad an education as I could from artists who were creating movement-based theater, because I really wanted to create work that was building on where that work was now, in lieu of trying to reinvent a wheel. And I spent 3 years assisting Martha Clark, who's more of a choreographer-director, and after about 3 years of fantastic education, I needed to sort of go on to the work I was doing with actors. But one of the things I really got from a lot of these artists was that they allowed me to have permission, to have the freedom to know how to say yes to whatever process that I needed to make work, and to whatever material that I wanted to work on, and to create my own nest to brew performance in. The American theater, mostly is playwright-centric, so a theater will pick a play, and often very wonderful plays, but it starts with a scripted play that's usually finished or close to being finished, and a production team will be assembled around it. And this process really is more about writing a piece in a rehearsal room with actors, with designers, with a dramaturg, and it takes a couple of years, and so you kind of have to build your own nest to do it. So I started my company. This is a picture from an adaptation of Antigone that I created called Fire Throws. It was about 10 years after I was in Bali, and it took me about that long to find a way to use what I learned there in a very direct way. So you might not really see the connection, but there's something there. So I started this company. It's called Right Time, and the mission of it essentially is to develop and produce theater infused with rich language, visual power, and physical rigor. And those 3 things are really important to me because, again, like I said, language isn't going to go away like it does in a lot of dance theater projects. Let's see. Just have another slide that talks a little bit in more detail about some of the ideas and themes and values. I think probably the most important thing really here is just about collaboration, because actors really are like co-writers for me. I usually bring in a scene or a section of a book, and at the end of 5 hours know a little bit more through the work I've done with them through improvisation, whether that needs to be a dance, whether it needs to be just a piece of music, whether it needs to be a scene that's textually written. And it's kind of a very amorphous, organic process that happens with a lot of other people. So the first adaptation, I did a number of projects with the company before this project, but since we're talking about adaptation, we'll jump to Innocence, which is based on Edith Wharton's The House of Mirth. And while Rhoda from The Wave seems to be a sacrificial victim of her fears, Lily Bart, the heroine of the House of Mirth seemed to be all ambition to me, and that was an interesting switch. And I actually came to the House of Mirth while thinking a lot about Martha Stewart, which is sort of an odd pair, but Martha's rise from a working class family to the heights of wealth in American society and her iconic status as the arbiter of the beautiful life, and of course her tumultuous demise made her a fitting parallel to Lily Bart's rise and fall in New York society. Lily is similarly envied and idolized, hated and praised, and not content to ride the coattails of a dull, rich husband who would give her the money and power and social standing she craves. Lily looks for other ways to achieve the life she desires. But turn-of-the-century New York was not ready for her maverick self. So I'll show just a few more images from the show. We staged the piece on the 100th anniversary of the books being published. And while Women in 2005, when the project was premiered, may seemingly have had more options than those in the corseted 1905 world of privilege, Lawrence Selden's prescient question to Lily, success, what is success, is one that women of all classes have been struggling to answer for way more than 100 years. So you can see this is not a sort of merchant ivory realistic setting. A lot of my work is in a wide open space to be able to allow for large group movement sections to happen. So I'm going to show a video clip, and now we get into the fun switcheroo. So I can... No. Sorry. There's a few more things up here than there were before. Oh, shoot. All right. There we go. Okay. Here we go. Okay. So this first clip is sort of the beginning of our take of the very opening of the book, which takes place in Grand Central Station. And Lily first spies Lawrence Selden across the floor of Grand Central. And he's the man she really ought to marry, but he doesn't have enough money, so she won't. It's the great tragedy of the book that they never come together. This is from much later in the piece, when Lily has already lost her social standing. She's borrowed money from someone she shouldn't have. She's had to give up her place in society, take a job. The way that we've staged this essentially is like a fever dream. Technically, narratively in the book, she is working for a woman, she goes to the pharmacy, she takes her sleeping pills, and then she goes to work at a hat shop. All of these things are so horrific to Lily. This was not her idea of the life she wanted to have, that we decided we would stage it as a sequence, conflate many of these events, and make it into kind of a fever dream, where she's tossed and turned by events beyond her control. So our version of a hat shop is a series of sort of mechanized actions, and her sense of working in a shop like this that makes hats for the people she used to socialize with, to me, I imagine would make her feel like a machine. So we sort of literalize some of that action. Okay, so I'm going to skip ahead. There's a couple of other pieces we did in between this and that, but this is Fire Throws, the adaptation of Antigone that we created. And my version of Antigone, I guess I should start from whatever that Woolfian moment was for Antigone, and for me, that was in the cave after Creon imprisons her. And I thought, right before her suicide, and I thought, what was this woman thinking at this moment? She's more, I was interested in looking at her more than a symbol of the sort of, little guy against the powerful Creon, which is how often she's seen in the play, seen historically. And I thought, well, she's a young girl who's somewhat naive, and actually probably is aware at that moment of some of the sacrifices she's making. And so I wanted to tell the story basically as a memory play from inside this cave, and that the walls of the cave would become a sort of video surrounded by memories of the events of the play, so filtered through her memory, so not in necessarily a realistic way, but the way we see things through memory that are somewhat exaggerated. And the title of the piece is actually taken from Plato's allegory of the cave, where I imagined Antigone, quote, "Beyond the shadows the fire throws against the wall, she sees the forms themselves, and herself as she really is." So I had two Antigones in the show, the one we know from the original story, and the 2,400-year-old symbol she's become, looking back at her story and searching for a person inside the icon. So in this way, I was looking to shine light on an interior psychology. And I was also, this is the piece where I sort of found my way into using some Balinese movement. I chose to use a Balinese Baris dance, which is a warrior dance as a springboard for the chorus action. Actually, I should go back because you see more clearly from this, right? So this is not obviously traditional in Balinese dance, but some of the movements that they do, and I'll show you a little video and you can see it in action a little more. So I basically imagined the video surround the light and the sound, the image and action of the story, giving some new insight into this iconic woman's desire and drive. So I'll just show you a little video from that piece. This is actually a bunch of sections, all connected together. So, just to give you a broad overview. And my idea of the chorus was essentially to make it a chorus of Antigones. So any chorus section was a way of taking her and sort of magnifying it over 8 bodies. Choruses traditionally might be like a group of elders talking about the action, commenting on action. And I really wanted Antigone to comment on her own story, to reflect on her own story. So Antigone, the woman actress playing Antigone in present, is in the middle of that. She's at the front of that group.
Numberless are the world's wonders, but none more wonderful.
The music is music that Julia Eisenberg composed for the show, and the lyrics are all taken from choral passages from the play. And she actually also referenced the Indonesian influence by using a gamelan in the score. And it was played live by a group of 4 musicians. So some of this is live feed of Creon. We also did some shadow play, again trying to get into some sense of interiority for Antigone.
The wild horse and the mountain fool, birds of song and thought, rapid as it, statecraft and skill and care, like the spear of winter rain. He is secure from all winds, but born in the late wind of death he cannot stand.
This particular section is actually the Tiresias section, where Tiresias is projected on multiple screens. And So what we could do playing with scale was also helping the sense of who was a god.
Working both good and evil. When laws are kept, how proud the city stands. When laws are broken, what of the city then?
So just going to go back to where we were. Okay. So the next show I want to talk about is Septimus and Clarissa that some of you saw. It premiered last year. We worked on it from 2009 to 2011. It's based on Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway. Surprise, surprise. But this time I brought in a playwright, Ellen McLaughlin, to collaborate with me on it. I guess the moment, a Woolfian moment that drew me in for this particular project was the challenge of how to put the audience, or put on stage, I should say, the mind of a person with PTSD. Septimus Smith, who's one of the two lead characters, is a World War I veteran. Clarissa Dalloway is a well-to-do housewife in London, and the story is essentially a sort of yin and yang between the two characters where they never actually meet, but you sort of plunge into his terror-filled reality, living in London, trying to recover. And Clarissa, who is seemingly, she's the sort of exultant side of the moment, not the terror side, but really the two characters together, I think, are a sort of metaphor for Woolf herself. In this moment, you see this in video as well, it's from the very beginning of the show. Clarissa is atop this giant moving staircase. Septimus is the gentleman below, and we created this set piece, in fact, to suggest Clarissa's gracious London home and above, and Septimus's claustrophobic reality below. So that there's metal underneath that's caught and tangled and knotted. Wrought iron patterns above are pretty and elegant. So this became a sort of metaphor of the piece as a whole. The two characters are irreparably linked, and so they need to sort of have a home in the same unit. We use the unit in a bunch of different ways, which you'll see in a moment. Fabric spills off Clarissa's body, sort of giant amount of fabric, transforming it into an enormous skirt. The stairs turn like hands of a clock, transforming into a landscape of trench warfare, which actors climb and fall in dynamic and athletic ways. So it goes sort of through memories of Septimus's from wartime, alongside this day in June for Clarissa, who's about to throw a party. So I'll just show a few more images from this. This is a sort of vision of Septimus's with Evans, who's a commanding officer of his who was killed, and his death haunts him throughout the story. So this is a moment, in fact, Woolf imagined in her own visions that the birds were speaking in Greek. So we kind of borrowed from this imagery, and Evans sort of appears almost like a bird sometimes. This is a moment where young Clarissa is sort of something we call the narrow bed, which is a section from her past where she feels sort of caught in time. This is a segment from a wartime sequence that we'll see in video, and this is an image of Peter Walsh, who's the man Clarissa never married, who she meets again on this June day and wonders whether she should have. So I'm going to jump back to the video. And, oops, nope. Okay. I want to go to, there we go, okay. So we're not going to see 10 minutes of this, but we'll jump around a little bit. This is a sort of moving version of that opening image. It's the very beginning of the play. Basically, they never meet in the book. And when we did a workshop of this, we realized that that doesn't really work very well in the theater. Because a lot of people are like, why are they both in the story? So we created a series of sort of dreamlike things we called reckonings, which are sort of imagined meetings, or meetings in a kind of meta space between the characters, which we thought could help capture sort of what it is that draws Clarissa into his reality. It's a sort of ethereal thing in the book. and we just basically created these. This is one we call the Tempest, which is the very beginning of the book, in fact, which it's about to go into, is this. Clarissa opens the window onto a beautiful June day, but as she walks through London, she realizes there's a sound of a backfire, which she thinks is a gunshot, or imagines might be a gunshot, and Septimus's reality kind of keeps impinging on hers, so we essentially sort of boldly went into that and had his sort of haunting consciousness be part of her experience. I do a lot often with sort of multiple bodies playing characters, just to create compositions about, I mean, I hope people don't think too hard about it when they're watching, but in my mind it's a little like split selves or refractions of self, but in a way that's just an imagistic answer to that, hopefully not a cerebral idea of that. Here, I'll actually fast forward this just a little bit. This is a setup between Evans and Septimus, and once the dialogue happens, this whole sort of episode happens. It's hard to tell on the video, but it's actually kind of scary. It's moving quite fast when it's moving, and it's something that is pretty potent live in the space. Maybe I'll fast forward just a little bit over to another section. Actually, you know what? This is a sort of vision of Septimus as in the park. Literally, he's with his wife and he's seeing things. So this is, I guess, probably the most direct way that we staged whatever his PTSD-riddled mind looked like. Okay, so just for the sake of time, I will, go ahead. So a couple of pieces I'm working on right now. Let me turn this down. This is, I don't have any images from this piece because it's in process, but this is Heather Christian, who's the composer, who's also playing the lead role in it. It's an adaptation of The World is Round, a children's book by Gertrude Stein, which, not surprisingly, has something to do with women and ambition, because it's obviously something I'm interested in. In the story, it's basically about a young girl who sees a mountain and decides she's going to try to climb it. And that desire to climb and the challenge of the journey and the eerie loneliness atop the mountain when she arrives gives what I hope is a window into the joys and challenges of becoming an individual, what it means to grow up, to be ambitious, to surmount obstacles. This is just one of the songs Heather's written for it. It's actually a musical, and about 60% of it are songs. It's also, let me just go ahead because that's kind of irritating to talk over. It's actually conceived as a, oops, stop that. Okay, why don't I go to the next slide, which is actually a model of the set that we're working on. We're actually going to do a workshop of this in December. It's actually conceived as a 3-part experience for adults and children, not primarily for children. And the audience actually travels to the theater through an immersive corridor of sound, which is filled with ribbons of text on LED screens that are taken from interviews we've conducted with women of many different ages and backgrounds from across the city about ambition and goals. And I hope becomes kind of like a sound soup of real stories that people experience in a kind of fragmentary way before they step into Gertrude Stein's. So this is Mimi Lian's model. She's the set designer. And she was interested in, I didn't talk a lot about design in the other pieces, which I could have, but in this case at least, she wanted to create a visual palindrome. So there's a square raked white floor and a mirrored overhead by a cantilevered square white surface that eventually, when she reaches the top of the mountain, folds over the floor surface. And a circle is cut out of the upper white square through which ladders or aerial silks or other things can drop down. And this was really inspired by landscapes of Kiki Smith. And the space transforms architecturally in a sort of kinetic way that the staging will also reveal. So this is where we get into the link with Susan's piece. What happened? Did we run out? Oh, that's right, because it's just the video. The last piece that I'm working on is called Sylvan Wood. The last piece I'll talk about, I should say. And it actually began as an adaptation of a Virginia Woolf story. It sounds like a broken record. Called Kew Gardens, but they commissioned me to create something, and I found the story of hers, which takes place around a flower bed in a garden. The theater is People's Light Theater outside of Philly, and it's a collaboration with Longwood Gardens, also outside of Philadelphia, which is a magnificent botanic garden. And when I went there to build the piece, or think about building the piece, the original part of the garden, which is this arboretum with 150-year-old trees, that's sort of much more rough and raw and not as sort of tailored as much of the garden is, was the most interesting to me and really felt like a good setting for people about memory. So in fact, it's not really the story of Woolf's, but it's an original piece I'm writing in collaboration with designer Susan Rogers, who was also the set designer for many of the things you've seen up here. And it's a story about a woman named Isabel Wright, who is receiving a Lifetime Achievement Award and stops by her childhood home her childhood summer home to come face to face with her past. And in a garden, it's a site-specific piece where the audience travels with most of the text on headsets. So the sound design, the music, and the text of it will be built into a sound score that you hear as if you're sort of in the head of Isabel. And you sort of walk through the garden, passing certain areas, or sort of rooms, as we call them, filled with moments of her past. She's, of course, a retired memory specialist, we've made her into. So I'm going to play this is the last thing I'll play, and it's a film that we created, because we actually, a couple of weeks ago, had to present a sampling of the piece for some funders, and couldn't do it in the site where we were going to do it. So we thought, how are we going to do that? So we did some filming and created a version of it that can suggest a little bit of what the piece will feel like. Okay. This is just that's just a little map of the walking tour people will take.
When you look at a tall cluster of trees in a garden, you notice their height, admire the pattern of branches against sky, take in their distinct color and shape. If you look closely, you register the detail of the bark, the claw-footed meeting of tree to earth. You remember who you are walking with on this day, past these trees, whether you are laughing or crying, whether you run or drift gently by. You remember that you are in love with this person, or perhaps resent that they are in love with someone else. Maybe you dream of the person you wish you were walking with, or secretly wish to escape your actual companion.
So you would be basically taking this walk,
Memory
listening
has
to Isabel's
magical
voice
beauty.
in this way. So that's
Each
the
detail of a
simulation.
moment in time was a perfect imprint in your brain, accessible for years by simply seeing once again that distinct shape of tree, or moving at that particular speed of walk. A cucumber magnolia, so thick and solid in the earth. I cast my gaze upwards, and I seem to have been transported to another time. The house, which only a few moments ago was so blind and shut, is now alive, bursting with life, like a mirage, which could instantly evaporate and be lost in silence.
The audience will be kept relatively small, so
Can't have been more than 18
hopefully you
years
see
old.
the space as
I
you
barely
would.
recognize this
as the
girl
camera does
playing
now.
some game with Teresa, Thomas, and Elijah. Elijah! Teresa was always the dreamer. She and I would imagine a whole world of spirits in that garden. I leave Elijah notes on birch bark, a joke since he calls me Masha, says I am a Jacobian. He loves me, I think.
This is actually Estelle Parsons, who's doing the voiceover, who's going to be the voice of Isabella for us.
How was it that I came to marry him?
Uh-oh. The audio dropped out.
Oh, that's very strange.
Huh. Oh well. Computer gods are not with me today. I guess we'll see it without audio for a little bit. So I guess I'll just finish up as this is finishing up. That's too bad. Oh well. But there's probably one line from Virginia Woolf's story still in it, and Ingmar Bergman's Wild Strawberries is kind of figuring in there too. It may sound familiar, story of an 80-year-old woman. Okay, so this film and excerpts of work I've shared today I hope offer a little window into a sampling of the theater work I've made in the last 20 some odd years, inspired by the complexity and the beauty and the violence and the monumental energy of Woolf's Moment in Time. And so I hope this has given you a taste of where I'm at right now in my work in the theater and making original dance theater based on writing from our most necessary women authors and buoyed by the mysteries and desires and revelations of women's lives.
Thank you both. Questions?
I want to see Susan in the Sylvan Wood.
I want to be at the Silver.
It's not
Josh?
I guess an interesting sense you may have is there a difference between how Costa Rica people and government respond to the idea of climate change versus what we're dealing with here in the U.S.?
Yes, absolutely. I think there's a much greater acknowledgement of climate change and its impacts in Costa Rica, partly because there's been such a concerted effort in this country by think tanks and by a fairly small group of people to spread doubt about climate change and to promote doubt as kind of a product. There's a book called Merchants of Doubt, which if you haven't read, I think is really well worth your time. And it's really, to me, it's one of the big tragedies of our modern era. this sense that, you know, climate change is happening, whether we believe in it or not, and we really need to confront it, and it becomes more urgent with every passing year, and yet there's a lot of resistance in this country against that, against confronting it. And in Costa Rica, partly because it's a small country, it's easier, I think, to reach consensus and to motivate people, and partly because they have a history in the last 30 or 40 years of really turning around from being a frontier country that sort of based their economy on resource exploitation to being a country in which the economy is based in large part in taking advantage of these natural resources to attract ecotourists, which is not really compatible with things like climate change denial. So I think Costa Rica has been a lot more successful confronting climate change and realizing the reality of climate change than we have in this country. And they're also, sorry, I'm just 30 seconds more. Costa Rica has a lot of resources. They have a lot of hydropower resources. They get about almost 90% of their energy from renewable sources. So wind power, hydropower, geothermal power, and we don't have the resources and the infrastructure, unfortunately, yet to do that in this country.
Karen?
I'm ignorant about climate change, but I believe that it's happening. But when you were talking, I always thought plants take carbon dioxide out of the air and therefore are good. And so respiration was completely new to me. And I'm sure I learned it in biology once long ago. But anyway, if in that graph where you showed, you know, that as heat goes up, the amount of carbon dioxide released could exceed the amount that's absorbed, would that then make climate change much, much faster?
Yes, potentially there could be huge impacts if we get large ecosystem turnover from plants being net sinks of carbon and taking carbon dioxide in, to scenarios where you get this massive mortality of forests and plants die and rot and release carbon dioxide. There are some really scary climate models out there looking at what could happen to the Amazon basin in the next century if this becomes widespread and if plants can't adapt to these higher temperatures. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that they can't, that we're bumping up against that climate threshold already. So that's the really depressing part of my research.
Suzanne?
A question for Rachel. Are you able to do what you do in professional workshops with our students here? Are you able to do the text and the dance and the design?
Could I do that with students?
Yeah.
Here.
Yeah. In the work, can you workshop it like that?
You know, the funny thing is that one of the things I did in my ensemble creation class was that the first project they did, which are kind of ensemble-based adaptations, was Kew Gardens. And I didn't tell them that I had been working on it. That's not a case where I was like developing it with them necessarily. You know, I think we had some talks and, you know, very abstract conversations and production board meetings about the idea of creating a devised piece as like one of the repertory shows or in the new BA main stage series. So if that's what you mean, it's definitely possible. It's a pretty work-intensive thing. And so if it were, say, a course that students would take, it would probably have to be sort of a year-long thing or something pretty intensive or a multi-credit course in one semester. I would love to. I mean, actually, you know, it's one of those things that, you know, I think the students here are fantastically excited by this kind of work, and I always love the ensemble class most of all because there's just a kind of wonderful openness to that kind of process. So I hope so. Yeah.
Greg?
I also have a question for Rachel. Can you talk a little bit about the role of story in your work? Because you do adaptation, but you're also abstracting as you're adapting.
Yeah.
And so, just when you were talking, I thought of the filmmaker Maya Deren, who's from, you know, I know, I'm sure. She talks about, like, in her work, which is avant-garde, 1940s, and onward filmmaking, like two axes. in her filmmaking, the horizontal and the vertical. And the horizontal is just sort of pile-driving narrative flow, you know, getting from A to wherever and telling the story. And she says that most storytelling in film, certainly in movies, but also in theater and novels, is so horizontally driven. The vertical dimension, which is, you know, feeling, association, metaphor, etc., is there, but it's always subservient to the horizontal. What she's trying to do is sort of balance the two out so that, you know, you keep stopping at a narrative moment to explore. And it just struck me that you're doing maybe something similar, but I'm not sure that the emphases are quite the same.
It does sound very similar. I mean, I do think that, you know, personally, I can go see a piece of theater or a dance piece where if it's so imagistically beautiful, I'm like, whatever it can be about, I don't care what it's about, because I'll just be in love with it. But I think if you sort of take the tenor of the average audience goer in theater, that they're looking for story, they're looking for a character to invest in. And my sense of it is that as soon as you give enough of an anchor for them to know sort of where you are and who you are with and whose point of view you're in, that you can sort of go anywhere. And so what I try to do is establish enough so that those people who generally need that horizontal storytelling have enough to feel comfortable, but that the way the story is explored is more metaphoric. I mean, like an example in the House of Mirth that I did, the sort of pivotal moment of the story is when Lily goes to her aunt Peniston and asks for a loan to pay off this amount of money she's borrowed from someone she shouldn't have borrowed money from. And she turns her down and says, you know, and that's her last hope, to be able to not go spiral into poverty, because Lily won't give in to the blackmail that this man is weighing against her. And so it's a really important moment of the book. So for me, it has to be a real powerful imagistic moment. And so Mrs. Peniston was in a skirt, a velvet skirt that was like the size of this room. And she was in the middle of it, and the scene took place on her skirt. And after the scene was over, the rest of the ensemble sort of lifted it up, and it flew over her head, and Lily appeared on it, and it became a sort of roiling sea that she sort of tried to walk on and couldn't. And like, to me, like, I would rather have that gorgeous image than have someone explain to me, and then Lily fell down to dire straits. Because at that point, I'm so moved that I don't want to go up here. I want to be like in a tactile, experiential place where I'm just sound and image are hitting me. So I think that a book on stage is still a book when it's cerebral. So for me, image and kinetic action is a way to theatricalize it. So, but I'm not sort of interested in doing something that's just impressions, because then I think you give up a desire for an arc. And that's not the case that of course some people don't mind that, but I want people to go to that and say they saw the story of the House of Mirth and not come away saying it sort of reminded me of Lily a little, you know.
Does it bother you if people don't get the associations of the metaphors?
No. I hope it's, I mean, usually, you know, in any kind of theater, audiences come away with things you never intend. And sometimes it's a lot better than what you intended. And sometimes it's another element, and that's like what you know, you can't dictate what an audience is going to take away. I mean, I just try to make something as specific as possible so it's articulating what I'd like it to articulate. But dance and image is never going to be that specific. So it's, to me, you know, it is, I put it out into the world and hope people get something from it. So.
Thank you both. That's really good.